We talk a lot on this channel about organizing your memoir in terms of its narrative structure. But what we don't talk about as often is how to actually organize your memoir. In this digital world, we can end up with so many files spread across so many programs that we end up digging ourselves into a pit we didn't even realize we were digging. And that's why today I want to give you our top 4 rules for organizing your memoir digitally. Stay tuned. Most memoirs don't stall because of lack of time. Most memoirs stall because of lack of clarity. And that's why I put together the Memoir Method Checklist. The idea here is to give you every single step in the process, not because that makes it easy, of course not, but because no project is ever completed until you know what the steps in the process actually are. You can download it free at pageandpodium.com/checklist. Every once in a while, I'll work with a client who has been in the process of their book for 5, often 10, or even 15 years. And one of the things that comes up almost inevitably in these cases is that we have a number of sets of files that are scattered around the internet from the different points in that author's life that they have picked up and put down their book. Now, while there is no shame in taking breaks on your book, in fact, we even recommend that you plan some along the process. The problem comes when we are not setting ourselves up to pick that project back up later. Unfortunately, this is so common and often comes from a sense that if we pause and have to pick back up, we are just starting from scratch. But I can tell you, I just worked with a client who was able to submit their book. They were able to get that book contract and they just sent the manuscript into the press. And I want to reflect back on that client's kickoff with me. When we sat down on that call, which is something we do with every single new client, whether it is a person joining our group program, a person who is doing one-on-one coaching, as with this client, or if you're doing ghostwriting, if you're publishing with us, any number of things, we always sit down with you at the beginning just to make sure we're lined up, just to make sure we have a sense of where you are. And one of the things that she said to me on this first call was, well, I am going to have to take some time and even figure out where this book is. Now, unfortunately, she had been picking at pieces of her book, but at the same time, she knew that there was more that she had written than she had in front of her. She just wasn't sure where it was. So what happened for this client was she ended up spending 2 or 3 weeks at the beginning of our engagement just sifting through things like her Google Drive, like her external hard drives, her email, just looking for any place she might have dropped some of these files. Now, if that sounds familiar to you or if that sounds like your worst nightmare, then this episode is for you because I want to give you some tools that you can use to set up your writing so that no matter what comes up to block the process, no matter whether you're taking planned or unplanned breaks, you are in the best possible position to pick that book up right where you left off and go ahead and get it across the finish line just like our client did. Okay, so as we're diving in here, one thing that I do want to be really clear about is that I am not going to give you specifics on the particular digital tools that you use. I have no interest in continuing to convince people to buy more and more subscriptions. Instead, I want to give you just some rules, some guidelines that you can use that will help you no matter what programs you're using, just to make sure that you are keeping things together and organized so that you can find what you need when you need it. But I do want to say the entire goal of this process is to simplify things. So if you are like me and you tend to want to overcomplicate everything, just don't. Instead, we are trying to simplify. So instead, what we are going to do is take what you're already doing and make it work a little bit better for you. Okay, so let's start with our first tip, and that is keep everything in one place. Now, I understand that most people do set out to write their memoir with this already in mind. Most of us already realize that we need to just kind of be working in one area or another. But what unfortunately happens is that when we put down our book and pick it back up, or if we are somebody that is attracted by the shiny, sparkling lights of new technology, we often can end up with the best intentions, but not quite as good of an outcome. And that is why this first tip is going to require a lot of intentional thought. Now, if you are somebody who is old school, you are writing in Microsoft Word, that is pretty easy for you. The thing I'm going to recommend is that you just simply create a folder wherever it is that you have most of your files. So if that on your computer is in the My Documents area, that's great. If you are somebody like me who has Dropbox or some similar type of a program set up to back up your files, that would be a great place to store it too. But I want you to think about when you're looking for ordinary files, say your taxes or other things that you don't visit very often. Where do you look for those things? That's where I want you to create a folder. Now, this might look a little bit different if you're somebody that's, say, writing in Google Docs or if you're writing in a program like Scrivener, but I still want to encourage you to think about a place that you can keep everything together. And one of the things about Scrivener is that it does seem to give you lots of options for storing different things. And in fact, you can. You can put media, so videos, photos, anything that you want in the actual Scrivener file. But I want to recommend that you also include some kind of more generalized storage than that Scrivener file itself. And what I would recommend, what I do actually, is to create that folder in your Documents, Dropbox, wherever it might be, and then put your Scrivener file inside of it. That's going to give you a little bit more flexibility when you have different types of things coming back. The Scrivener file can start to feel a little bit overwhelming, so it's nice to just still have a centralized place. If you are somebody that is using a cloud-based writing program, whether that is Word on the web or something like a Google Docs, that is also fine. And particularly if that is where you do most of your work, by all means, keep it there. But as we're going through that Google Docs, I do still want you to create a folder. That way, every new doc that you create is not just floating in your recent files. Rather, you know exactly where everything is. Folders are your friends, and I highly, highly recommend that you use one folder to gather everything together wherever it is you're working. And then within that, if you'd like to create other folders, that is fine. But the main thing is everything for this project is going in this one centralized place. That way, even if you do have to go hunting for it years down the line, you only have one thing to find. That will make your life so much easier than trying to remember all the different places that you have written along the way. I want to give kind of like a follow-up to this tip. That is to say, if you are somebody that is working in different mediums, different formats, so for instance, if you are somebody who is using mostly Microsoft Word, but you also like to do hand journaling, or if you are somebody who is working mostly in Google Docs, but get some, say, editorial feedback, one thing that can be really helpful is to create a folder, whichever of those places you're in most, and then within that folder, create a file that just gives yourself a little breadcrumb. So that might be putting a folder that is a journaling log. In that log, you're going to log every time you've got a journal entry, every time you brainstorm something, log where that is, so that even though when we're talking digital manual or online, offline, it is kind of difficult to gather everything, we can at least know that everything that could be gathered is gathered, and everything that couldn't be gathered is so easy to track down. Okay, so that is our first tip, is we want you to create one centralized location where everything can be stored. And then, as a side note of that tip, if that is just not possible because you have different formats, different types of media, then go ahead and create a log for the other things that can't physically be stored in that place, just so that you have a total map of everything you have to work with. All right, that's my first tip. Second tip, I want you to take very seriously the idea of naming conventions. Now, when I say naming conventions, sometimes this is called file name conventions. All I'm talking about is what do you call each of the files you're creating as you're going through the process of your book. Now, this comes from a little bit of a joke that's kind of a little cliche joke that we toss around in writer circles, and that is that you should not name your book file book. And while I think that's kind of a funny thing to think about, because of course it is your book, but book is not very descriptive when we get into it, I do want to actually dig into this a little bit more. Oftentimes when we think of calling our book book, or something that is similarly vague or non-descriptive, oftentimes that is coming from a place of kind of wanting to just dip your toe in the water rather than dive into the deep end. And what I mean by that is probably the best thing to name your project is either the topic of your memoir with the name Memoir or the working title that you are using at this moment. I find that oftentimes people get a little bit nervous to do that. Naming the file book or naming the file, again, something else, working project, oftentimes is a way that we can kind of distance ourselves from the very real fear of digging into this project. But if we can push ourselves to really use the types of naming conventions that professional writers use, we really much more easily allow ourselves to step into the role of professional writer. And while not everyone wants to go pro, it is so helpful when you're trying to do a project that is going to turn out excellent and also feel good during the process. Oftentimes, stepping into that pro role, even as an amateur, can feel really good, and it can help us move forward. Effectively, that naming convention, whatever you call that main file, is a reflection of how seriously you're taking your book. But there obviously is much more to be discussed here, because as you are going through the actual writing process, you are likely producing quite a lot of files. One of the things that we really strongly recommend is that as you are moving through your book chapter by chapter by chapter, rather than just working on it as one long document, continuing to open that book document and type into it every single time you have a writing session, rather, we encourage you to start a new file for each chapter. Now, if this seems like it's going to be more overwhelming, remember, the reason it won't be is that you've got that single place to store everything. And in fact, bonus tip, for me, I have a file that is for my book. It's called the working title that I'm using right now. And within that, I have a file called chapter drafts. Now for me, I use a pretty standard naming convention, which is chapter 1, draft 1, chapter 2, draft 1, so on and so forth. And I also see a lot of people, this can be really helpful too, add a date. You likely won't need the date quite as much until you get to revision stage where you're opening and revising over and over. But if you want to add that date, go ahead and do that. The important thing here is that we have consistency. So if you are going through and naming each chapter, chapter X, draft 1, well, we know then that we can see at a glance how many chapters you've written, how they all stack up. It starts to be so exhilarating to see all of those chapter files, and you also give yourself a clean slate every time. This can be really helpful for removing the temptation to edit your last chapter rather than move forward to the next one. And it can just be really helpful too in your psyche to kind of give you that clean slate. You're creating every time kind of from a new idea, from a new sense of expression and creativity. So, however you want to approach this, the strong recommendation here is that you will look at your naming conventions, create some kind of a standard, and use that standard every single time. Okay, the third tip that we have for moving forward with your digitally organized book is we want you to create a couple of other spaces, a couple of other either documents or folders within that one hub where you can put the things that you will need to put along the way. Now, what kinds of things are we going to need to make room for in our central hub? Well, the first one is we may need a space for notes, and this can look a couple different ways. The first way we usually think of notes would be if you are doing some kind of research that could either be interviewing people in your family, your friends, or it could be actual research where you're digging into primary and secondary sources and trying to figure out something that is larger, not necessarily part of your life, although maybe, but oftentimes outside research that you're bringing in. Now, if you are doing something like that, where you are going to have some reference materials, one thing that we do and I recommend that you do is create a folder within your Hub folder that is called Notes. This way you can drop all of your research in there and make sure that you are not scrambling trying to find something. Now, let me say, if you are looking through websites and finding websites, blog posts, or digital journal articles, that kind of thing, I do recommend that you find some way to either download them or save the link, again, within that central hub. Make sure that any piece of research you have gathered, any notes that you have gathered, you know exactly where to find them, because there is nothing more frustrating than realizing that you used good naming conventions for your chapters, but that one article you know you have seen is nowhere to be found. It's so frustrating. So make sure that you are downloading all of your research, even from the internet, download it and get it into your hub. And the same way we use naming conventions for our chapters, we want to use some kind of descriptive name for that research. Don't let anything be in there called screenshot, because you're not going to know what that is. Instead, give yourself a note. Is this about a particular chapter? Is it about a particular topic? And maybe drop a date in there too, so that you've got some kind of sense of when you were downloading this, when you were reading and engaging with it last. The second way notes can show up is that as we're writing, especially early chapters, we will very often have thoughts about things we need to make sure we pick up in a later chapter. Either this is because we thought it would go in an earlier chapter and then when we got there, it just didn't feel very good, or more often I find the writing process itself stirs up new memories that we maybe hadn't planned on. Now, when this happens, when you know you've got a note that you need to remember for a future chapter, you have a couple of different options, but as with all of these tips, pick one and do it this way every time. Either in that notes folder I mentioned a second ago, you can create a notes document for future chapters, either one per chapter, one for all of your chapters, or my preference, you should have your outline already finalized by the time you're writing. And that means you have a valuable planning document in that outline. Now, my recommendation, if you have that finalized outline, as you are moving through the writing process and you have ideas for future chapters, open that outline and drop the idea in the chapter where it goes. What this does for you is eliminates the need to even search. Every time you start a new chapter, you should be pulling your outline up, refreshing your memory of what goes in there. And since you're already in that outline, why not leave yourself the note in the outline? That way you make sure that that information, that idea, serves you when you need it. So whether you decide to do a notes folder where you are dropping in pieces of research as well as logs of ideas you have for future chapters, or you decide that you can just leave notes in your outline and that will work fine, I want you to pick one or the other, but make sure that you have thought about where you want to store your notes, both any research you might include and any notes that you have for your future self when you get to that later chapter. The second area I want to make sure that you have in this file hub is an area for cut pieces. One of the things that is just the truth about writing a book is you will write things that you will later cut. Now, sometimes those things will be cut and put somewhere else in the book. Sometimes they will be cut and never see the light of day again. Sometimes they will be cut and be worked into either a future book or some kind of promotional piece, either a guest article, social media piece, etc. No matter what is going to happen to those cut pieces, I want to make sure that you don't lose them. Not only does this allow you to use those pieces later, it also keeps that cutting process from feeling so bad. There is nothing worse than feeling like you're just deleting pages of your writing, never to be heard from again. So we're not going to do that. Instead, I want you to create a file A single file will work just fine for this, by the way. And that is where you are going to drop every cut piece out of your memoir. Whether that's a scene, whether that's a couple of sentences of realization or message, whether that is pages. I want to make sure that you keep all of that stuff in one place so that you know you've got that bank to return to. So the second thing you're going to include is something for your cut pieces. And the third thing that I want you to keep within this hub is some place where you can dump your future ideas. One of the things that happens to me every single time I'm writing a book, and it happens to most clients as well, is that as you get into the chapter train, chapter, you are just writing a chapter after a chapter, and you really feel like you've got that momentum. One of the things that will inevitably slow you down is the sense that there is a different book you would rather be writing. If this has not happened to you, truly, it often comes about halfway or further for me, so it may be coming. Either way, I want to make sure that you have a place to hold those future idea notes, because right now, they're not useful. Right now, we do not want to derail the project you're in the middle of by starting a new project. It is not the time for that. But what we do want to make sure is that if that idea is a good idea, and we have no reason to believe it's not, I want to make sure we can come back to it and revisit it. Now, I have done this different ways over my life, but to me, the most effective way that I have done this is by keeping something called a promise file. Now, if you are working on one single book, I would recommend keeping this file within that book's hub. Everything together, remember? If you are somebody that is working on a number of books, you may have a different space where you keep this. But if you're on your first book, if it's your only book that you have started in earnest, keep this place in your hub. What the promise file is, it is a promise to yourself that when the time is right, you will seriously consider that idea. And the way that you can do this is by keeping a file folder, promise folder, and then within that, whenever you have your idea for your new book or a podcast or a documentary or whatever it may be, I want you to create a new file, dump out every single idea, every thought, every impulse, why this feels good, why you think you should do this instead of the old project, everything in your brain. Dump it all out, and then save that file with the name that project will have into your promise folder. This does a couple things for us. Of course, it does help us keep track of that idea. But the other thing, very similar to with our cut pieces area, when we have this promise file, we also have made the commitment to ourselves that we are moving forward with our current project, and we know that moving forward is going to require us to clear our brain. We cannot be simultaneously writing two projects at once. So by having this promise file, the promise folder, however you want to set it up, you are giving yourself the very best chance of actually moving forward with the project you've committed to and following up with the new project when the time is right. Okay, so as part of this area where we've got different places for different things, remember we are going to have some kind of a notes/research area. We'll have some convention for making notes to ourselves about future chapters. We will have a place where we can put our cut pieces. And finally, we are going to have some kind of a promise folder, some kind of a future ideas folder, where we can put things that are not right now related to this project, but that we know we're going to want to embark on, maybe, probably, in the future. Okay, my fourth and final tip for keeping your digital book organized is I want you to choose one tool and stick with it. One thing that happens so often, and shout out to Scrivener because I do love that program, but one thing that happens too often is that folks are getting started, they're starting to really just dip their toe in the momentum of the book writing process, and then a shiny object pops up. And don't we all love a shiny object? So too often, we will abandon the efforts we have been making before because we see another digital tool. And so often, this is Scrivener. Now, Scrivener is great. You will hear it talked about all over the internet. We do use Scrivener at Page and Podium, but you do not need Scrivener. And one thing I really want you to hear me say is that writing a memoir is just putting one word after another until you have 60 or 80,000 of them. Is all you are doing. Now, is that an oversimplification? Of course it is. But when we start thinking about technology tools that we need, you don't. The generations of writers that came before us did not have Scrivener. They didn't even have computers. Can you imagine writing a book by hand or on a typewriter? I learned to type on a typewriter, and this seems just really mind-blowing to me. So we have these digital tools, and my point is, we actually don't need any of them. We actually could just take a piece of paper and a pen and write. And the point is not that that would be better or worse. The point is that when we switch mediums as we are moving through the process, we are very, very likely just giving ourselves an unnecessary obstacle. Could you write your book in Scrivener? Yes. Could you write your book in Microsoft Word? Also yes. Could you write your book by hand or on a typewriter? Also yes. So the tip here, in the spirit of simplifying, which is what we're doing in this video, the tip here is to choose one tool and stick with it. If for you that's Scrivener, that is great. But if it's not, don't be intimidated. Don't feel like you're missing out on something that everybody else has. Scrivener can be really useful, but it's often going to derail your process to stop in the middle of writing and learn Scrivener, which is not a simple tool, by the way. There are many, many bells and whistles, of which you probably need about 5%. So rather than chasing shiny objects, this fourth tip, pick a medium, pick a tool, and stick with it. I promise. If you stick with the plan, if you stick with your routine, you will make so much more progress. Even though I know one word after another feels so slow, once those words start to add up, and it doesn't take long, you will start to feel the momentum of having the words add up. We need to protect that at all costs. And the way we're doing it, in this video at least, is keeping everything in one place, making sure that we can find it back by setting ourselves up with naming conventions, giving ourselves a place to put all those little miscellaneous pieces we need, and not switching around between different writing softwares. Okay, I hope that this has been a helpful video. I realize that much of what we're saying here is actually pretty common sense. But one thing I do find is that with all the writing advice that floats around out there, it can be really, really difficult to simplify. And in fact, that's what so many memoirs need. If it would be helpful to have a full checklist of every single step you'll need to take from the process of developing your memoir all the way through to marketing and publishing, you can download our Memoir Method checklist at pageandpodium.com/checklist. Otherwise, if we can help with your writing journey, please reach out. We would love to hear about your book. And in the meantime, happy writing. Most memoirs don't fail for lack of time. They fail for lack of clarity, because their author is trying to move forward in a process that is unfamiliar and unclear with no one to support their efforts. And that's why I put together something very practical, the Memoir Method Checklist. This is designed to give you every single step in the process so you not only know what you need to work on now, you know what's coming next, and after that, until you have that beautiful published book in your hands. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.